Okay, so before we start working on intentionally building and breaking habits, it's important to understand what habits are exactly and how they're formed. But first, let's talk about what habits aren't. A habit isn't a goal, it isn't a morning routine or an evening routine, it's not a to-do list or a New Year's resolution. A habit also isn't an addiction, although certain habits can become addictions with enough exposure over time. Habits are learned behaviors that we repeatedly do, often subconsciously. We perform hundreds of these every day. They can be involuntary things like slouching or biting our nails, and they're often so ingrained that we barely think about them, like brushing our teeth every day. Whether you realize it or not, you have been building and breaking habits your entire life. It's been estimated that 70% of our waking behavior is habitual, so naturally, habits play a huge role in what we do and who we become. From an evolutionary perspective, the purpose of habits is to make humans more effective. Scientific research estimates that our brains are bombarded with roughly 11 million bits of information every second. Meanwhile, our conscious minds can only process around 40 to 50 bits of information every second. So at this very moment, the sound of the baby crying next door, the fly zipping around your head, the smell of the garbage truck passing by, and the feeling of sitting in your chair might be within your field of perception. But you don't have the bandwidth to process all of this at once. You probably got just enough awareness to pay attention to what I'm saying right now. In our day-to-day life, unconscious behaviors like habits are what allow us to filter out information effectively without our brains freezing up like an overheated laptop. And there are 4 defining features that make a habit a habit. They involve an ordered, structured sequence of actions triggered by a cue. This could be a situation, event, or time of day. They are learned over time by being repeated over and over again. They're persistent, fixed, and stubborn as hell. Once they're formed, they're very difficult, but not impossible to break. And they're performed almost automatically, without conscious thought. It's helpful to understand these 4 defining characteristics of habits so you can understand the habits that you want to build going forward, and to help you know exactly when something makes the switch from conscious action to automatic habit. Now, according to behavior science, there are 2 different ways a habit can form, and that's through classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is when 2 unrelated stimuli link together. Let's say that you have a pet sloth, and before you feed him every day, you ring a bell. So you ring the bell, then feed your sloth. Ring the bell, then feed your sloth, day after day. It won't take long until your little sloth friend is conditioned to expect food at the ringing of a bell. He might even start drooling with anticipation. You might have heard of this referred to as a Pavlovian response. Alone, these stimuli mean nothing, but linked together, they can become very powerful. The other way that habits are formed is through operant conditioning, where specific rewards or consequences are associated with a certain behavior. You perform an action, and there's an expected outcome. Let's say that you want to train your sloth to do a trick. Well, every time he completes the trick, you could reward him with a delicious treat. With enough repetition over time, your sloth will become a world-class entertainer. And this can also be used to break behaviors. Every time your sloth chews on your phone charger, you could spray him with a water bottle. It's not very nice, but it won't take long for him to identify that chewing on a phone charger leads to an unpleasant outcome. And the good news is that these strategies aren't just great for training sloths. They also work really well on humans, although I'd advise that you don't spray yourself in the face with water. We're going to be using both of these conditioning processes throughout the course to help you introduce new habits and break old ones. At this point, you might be wondering how. How does all of this work in the brain, and why do behaviors stick with repetition? Well, the early stages of habit formation doesn't just involve one part or process of the brain, but rather an orchestra of cells, hormones, and neural pathways. As you repeat the same action over and over again, it causes neurons to fire together, and as neuroscientists put it, wire together. They literally solidify as a chunk in your brain. Once this sequence of actions is deeply ingrained, behaviors start to become more effortless. This is when another part of your brain takes over to simply monitor for cues. When it senses a cue, it knows it's time to engage in a specific behavior. And here's the really cool thing about our brains. Through neuroplasticity, it's possible to change the connections between neurons to learn and unlearn habits. With enough dedication, our brains can change to form new connections and new pathways. So no matter how stuck you feel right now, you need to know that your brain is fully prepared and ready to make changes. Now that you understand the foundational components of what makes a habit, it's time to take a deeper look at your own behavior. So I want you to open up your workbook to exercise 1 and do an audit of all your existing habits, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Over the course of a day, monitor which behaviors you already have under your belt, and make sure not to judge yourself too harshly. The idea of this exercise is to start to get an idea of where you're at and to think about which habits you'd like to add, solidify, or eliminate going forward. What I hope you realize from this exercise is that you're not starting from scratch. There are many helpful habits that you already do on a regular basis that will become the foundation for future positive change in your life.